In the high, thin air of the Colorado Rockies, where winter was not a season but a predator, a man's worth could be measured by the smoke from his chimney. Thick, black, and voluminous smoke was a sign of life, a declaration of defiance against the cold. It meant a fire roared in the hearth, that a family was fighting to survive another day. But on the harshest days, when the mercury hit at the bottom of the thermometer and the wind carried the malice of a razor, one chimney in the valley told a different story. From John Thornton's cabin, only a pale, shimmering wisp of heat rose into the crystalline air, almost invisible against the snow-laden pines. His neighbors, huddled close to their own roaring, hungry stoves, saw this strange lack of smoke and pitied him. They imagined a pathetic, dying fire, a man too poor or too weak to feed it. They imagined a cabin filled with a cold as sharp and deadly as an icicle to the heart. They were wrong. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of quiet genius and forgotten history fascinate you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more compelling. The truth of John Thornton's obsession began not with fire, but with its absence. It had been the winter of '81, a year before his neighbors began to whisper about his sanity. That winter had been ordinary in its cruelty. The snows came early and stayed late. The cold was a physical weight, pressing on the log walls of the small cabin he had built with his own hands. Inside, the pot-bellied stove, a standard cast-iron model purchased from a catalog, was the disappointing center of their world. It was a voracious, inefficient beast. John fed it a constant diet of pine and aspen, and in return, it gave them a small circle of scorching heat and a room full of drafts and bone-aching chill. His wife, Mary, had taken ill in the autumn, a cough that settled deep in her chest and refused to leave. The doctor from the mining town miles away had given it a name, pneumonia, and prescribed rest and warmth. Rest was possible. Warmth was a commodity more precious than gold. John worked tirelessly to provide it. He spent his days in the forest, his axe ringing against frozen wood, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He hauled sled after sled of logs back to the cabin, stacking them in a mountain against the wall. He spent his nights feeding the insatiable stove. He would load it with wood until it glowed a dull cherry red. The metal would tick and ping with the heat, and for a few precious minutes, the warmth would push back the cold that seeped through the chinking and under the door. But the stove consumed its fuel with a furious hunger. The fire would roar, and a torrent of heat, along with thick black smoke, would rush up the stovepipe and be lost to the winter sky. Within an hour, the roar would die to a whisper, the red glow would fade, and the chill would creep back into the room. Mary lay in their bed, bundled in every blanket and quilt they owned. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged sound that seemed to John like the scraping of a dry leaf on frozen ground. He would sit by her side, holding her hand, feeling the feverish heat of her skin even as she shivered. He watched the stove, hating it. He saw the smoke, the thick, greasy, particle-laden smoke that choked the air and painted the ceiling with a film of creosote. He saw it as wasted energy, as fuel that was failing to burn, as life escaping uselessly into the uncaring cold. "It's so cold, John," she would whisper, her voice thin and reedy. "Can you put more wood on the fire?" He would rise, his joints aching from the damp chill, and open the stove door. A plume of acrid smoke would billow into the room, making them both cough. He would shove more logs into its greedy maw, and the cycle would begin again. A brief, inadequate surge of heat, followed by the inevitable decline into a cold that felt deeper and more profound each time. He was a man trapped in a paradox. The more fuel he burned, the more obvious it became that the fire was failing them. The tragedy reached its inevitable, quiet conclusion on a January morning. The fire had died in the deep of the night, while John, exhausted, had finally succumbed to a brief, fitful sleep. He awoke to a silence that was colder and more absolute than any he had ever known. The air in the cabin was glacial. A delicate lacework of frost covered the inside of the window panes. Mary was still. The faint, ragged sound of her breathing was gone. In the crushing grief that followed, a new feeling began to crystallize, a cold, hard anger. It was not an anger at God or at the winter. It was an anger at the stove, at the accepted, conventional wisdom that said this was just the way things were. In the weeks of numb solitude that followed, John's grief transformed. It hardened from a sorrow into a purpose. He looked at the stove, the source of his failure, and saw not just a piece of metal, but a problem to be solved. Everyone accepted the flaws, They accepted the endless work of cutting wood, the constant feeding of the fire, the smoky rooms, the persistent, creeping cold. They accepted it as a condition of life in the mountains, an unavoidable hardship. John Thornton, in the silent depths of his loss, rejected that acceptance. He came to believe that the problem was not the winter, the problem was ignorance, and ignorance could be conquered. His singular focus became a quiet scandal in the small, scattered community. The seasons turned, the snows melted, and the high meadows burst into a riot of wildflowers. But John Thornton did not return to his normal life. His traps, which had once provided a steady income of pelts, lay rusting in a shed. He was seen less and less on the trails, his familiar, steady presence replaced by rumor and speculation. He was consumed. His cabin became a laboratory. He dismantled the hated pot-bellied stove, laying its cast-iron parts out on the floor like the bones of a dissected animal. He sat for hours, sketching in a worn leather-bound journal, his brow furrowed in concentration. He built small fires in the yard, not for warmth, but for observation. He experimented with different types of wood, different arrangements of fuel, different ways of controlling the flow of air. He was no longer just a frontiersman. He was an engineer, a physicist, a student of thermodynamics, though he would not have known those words. He studied the smoke. He held a piece of tin in the plume and watched it become coated with a black, tarry substance. He smelled it. He felt its greasy texture. This was the enemy. This was the waste. This, he knew with an unshakable certainty, was unburnt fuel. His neighbors saw him tending these strange little fires and shook their heads. They saw a man lost in his grief, performing strange, pointless rituals. They did not see the methodical, relentless process of research that was unfolding. His own small experiments could only take him so far. He realized he was looking at the problem from the wrong end. He was studying a failed system. He needed to find a successful one. Where did men create and control intense, efficient heat? The answer came to him one day as he sharpened his axe on a grindstone. The sparks, the intense, localized heat. The forge. He packed a small bag with provisions, locked the door to his cabin, and set off on foot for the mining town of Crested Butte, a 2-day walk over the mountains. The town was a noisy, chaotic hub of industry, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of his valley. But John was not there for the saloons or the society. He was there for the noise and the heat. He found the blacksmith shop, a dark, cavernous building that smelled of coal smoke, hot metal, and sweat. The blacksmith, a man named Silas, was a mountain of a man with arms like tree limbs and a face permanently smudged with soot. He was initially suspicious of the quiet man from the woods who asked so many strange questions. John did not ask about shoeing horses or repairing wagon wheels. He asked about the fire. He asked about the forge itself, a massive structure of brick and stone. He asked how Silas controlled the heat, how he could bring a piece of iron from black to a glowing, malleable white heat so quickly. Silas, who was more accustomed to talk of ore prices and weather, was intrigued by John's intense, focused curiosity. He was a master of his craft, and like any master, he enjoyed explaining its intricacies. He became the unwitting catalyst for John's breakthrough. "It's all about the air," Silas explained, gesturing with a pair of tongs towards the heart of his forge. "Not just any air. The right air, in the right place, at the right time." He showed John the large bellows that fed a powerful jet of air, the primary air, up through the bed of burning coal. "This gets it hot," Silas grunted, pumping the handle. The fire roared, a vortex of incandescent fury. "But that's just a rough heat, dirty, smoky." Then he pointed to something John had not noticed, a series of small holes in the brickwork above the main firebed. "The real magic," Silas said, a glint in his eye, "is here." He explained that as the hot, smoky gases rose from the burning coal, they were met by a slow, steady stream of fresh air trickling through these upper holes. This air, he explained, was heated by the brick itself before it entered the chamber. "What does that do?" John asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It burns the smoke," Silas said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He told John to watch. As the fire reached its peak temperature, the thick black smoke rising from the coal seemed to vanish. In its place, shimmering, almost transparent waves of heat rose, and occasionally a ghostly blue flame would dance and flicker in the space above the coal. It was the eureka moment. John stared, mesmerized. It was staged combustion. a primary burn to gasify the fuel, and a secondary burn at a higher temperature and with a fresh supply of preheated oxygen to ignite the resulting gases. The smoke was not a waste product, it was an intermediate fuel. The conventional stove was like a blacksmith trying to work iron with only the first smoky phase of the fire. It was fundamentally incomplete. His research did not end there. Silas's forge had solved the riddle of the smoke, but what about retaining the heat? The forge was designed for intense, concentrated heat, not for warming a space over a long period. John began to look at other structures in the town. He saw the massive brick ovens at the bakery. The bakers would fire them for a few hours until the bricks were saturated with heat, then rake out the coals and bake bread all day using only the stored thermal energy. The heat wasn't lost up the flue, it was absorbed and held by the sheer mass of the brickwork. Thermal mass. That was the second piece of the puzzle. A standard cast iron stove had very little mass. It heated up quickly and cooled down just as fast. The heat it produced was sharp and radiant, but fleeting. A stove needed to be more like a baker's oven. It needed a body, a core of heavy, dense material to soak up the intense heat of the secondary combustion and then release it slowly, gently, into the room for hours. John spent 2 more days in Crested Butte, sketching furiously in his journal. He drew cross-sections of the forge, diagrams of the bakery oven. He filled pages with calculations and designs combining the principles he had discovered. A small, insulated firebox for the primary burn. A system of channels to draw in and preheat the secondary air. A baffle plate to force the hot gases on a long, convoluted path. And surrounding it all, a massive outer shell of stone and clay. He returned to his valley, a man transformed. The grief was still there, a cold stone in his heart, but it was now encased in a shell of determined purpose. He went to the trading post, his journal of sketches in hand. His shopping list was bizarre. He didn't buy flour or salt or traps. He bought sheets of iron, a bag of fire clay, and several lengths of iron pipe. The storekeeper looked at the list, then at John, his expression a mixture of pity and concern. But he took John's money. The quiet frontiersman had become the obsessive innovator, and the construction was about to begin. The work started in the late summer as the first hints of yellow began to touch the aspen leaves on the high slopes. John dismantled the interior of his cabin with a ruthless efficiency. The bed where Mary had died, the table where they had shared their meals, it was all moved aside. The center of the cabin floor was cleared down to the packed earth. This would be the foundation for his machine. His son, Samuel, a quiet, lanky boy of 16, watched his father with a mixture of awe and confusion. He had mourned his mother in the silent way of a boy who had known only the quiet rhythms of the mountains. Now, he saw his father moving with a fire he hadn't seen in years, and he offered the only thing he had, his hands. He became John's silent apprentice, his ally against the coming tide of doubt. The labor was methodical and immense. First, they laid a foundation of large, flat stones, carefully leveled and mortared together with a mixture of clay and sand. Upon this base, the heart of the stove began to take shape. John, using the sheet iron he had purchased, began to fabricate the inner firebox. It was a complex and painstaking process. He cut the iron with a cold chisel and hammer, the sharp ring of metal on metal echoing through the valley. He drilled holes with a hand-cranked auger and fastened the pieces together with rivets, painstakingly peened into place. This was not a simple box, it was a chamber within a chamber. The inner box, where the primary fire would burn, was lined with a thin layer of fire clay to protect the iron from the intense heat. Around this inner box, he constructed a second, slightly larger box, creating a narrow air gap. Into this gap, he inserted the iron pipes he had bought. These were the secondary air inlets. They would draw air from near the floor, channel it up through the hot space between the 2 iron walls, preheating it before injecting it through a series of carefully drilled holes at the top of the primary firebox, just below a heavy iron plate that served as a baffle. This baffle was crucial. It would prevent the flames and hot gases from escaping directly up the chimney, forcing them to travel a longer, S-shaped path, ensuring a more complete secondary burn and maximizing the time they had to transfer their heat to the stove's body. This intricate metal heart was only the beginning. The true bulk of the work lay in constructing the outer shell, the thermal mass. John and Samuel spent weeks scouring the surrounding hillsides and creek beds for the right stones. Not just any rocks would do. John sought out dense, heavy stones, granite and river-worn gneiss, rejecting the lighter, more porous sandstone. They hauled the stones back to the cabin on a crude wooden sledge, their muscles straining with the effort. They began to build the stone shell around the iron core, leaving a few inches of space for the hot gases to circulate. The work was like building a giant, intricate puzzle. Each stone was chosen for its shape and size, fitted carefully against its neighbors. They were not held together with cement, which would crack under the intense heat cycles. Instead, John used a mortar he mixed himself, a precise recipe of clay, sand, and chopped horsehair for tensile strength. He had learned the basics from Silas the blacksmith, who used a similar mixture to repair his forge. Day after day, the structure grew, a massive, monolithic block of stone and clay rising in the center of the small cabin. It consumed the space, transforming the room from a living area into something that felt more like a temple or a tomb. It was this strange, monumental construction that drew the attention and mockery of his neighbors. Trappers and homesteaders passing by would stop and stare. Their own cabins were built for space and light. John Thornton seemed to be filling his with a mountain of rock. Garrett, a bluff, practical man whose homestead was a mile down the valley, became the primary voice of the community's skepticism. He would ride over on his horse, a bemused smirk on his face, and watch John and Samuel patiently setting stones. John, his hands covered in clay mortar, simply looked at him and said, "A stove." Garrett laughed, a loud, booming sound. "A stove? That's no stove, man. That's a fortress. You could roast a whole buffalo in that thing. I call it Thornton's Folly." The name stuck. The strange project became a source of amusement and gossip in the valley. Thornton's Folly was the talk of the trading post. People speculated he had lost his mind to grief. They questioned his sanity, his judgment. Why would a man waste his summer building a pile of rocks inside his own house when he should be laying in wood and meat for the winter? The mockery was constant, a low hum of disbelief and ridicule. John heard the whispers. Samuel heard the taunts from other boys, but they did not stop. Within the brute mass of the stone, the hidden genius of the design lay in its subtle details. The secondary air pipes were not just straight tubes. They were angled slightly downwards where they entered the firebox, creating a swirling, turbulent flow that mixed the hot air and smoke more effectively. The S-shaped path for the exhaust gases, created by the iron baffle plate and another strategically placed stone shelf, was calculated to be just long enough to extract the maximum amount of heat before the gases, now much cooler, finally entered the stovepipe that rose through the roof. The door to the firebox was not a flimsy, leaky piece of cast iron. John had fabricated it himself from a heavy iron plate with a simple but effective rotating vent that allowed for precise control of the primary air intake. It was not a door you could simply slam shut. It was a valve you sealed. Every element was designed with a single purpose, to capture and control every possible unit of thermal energy from the wood. Within the brute mass of the stone, the hidden genius of the design lay in its subtle details. The secondary air pipes were not just straight tubes. They were angled slightly downwards where they entered the firebox, creating a swirling, turbulent flow that mixed the hot air and smoke more effectively. The S-shaped path for the exhaust gases, created by the iron baffle plate and another strategically placed stone shelf, was calculated to be just long enough to extract the maximum amount of heat before the gases, now much cooler, finally entered the stovepipe that rose through the roof. The door to the firebox was not a flimsy, leaky piece of cast iron. John had fabricated it himself from a heavy iron plate with a simple but effective rotating vent that allowed for precise control of the primary air intake. It was not a door you could simply slam shut. It was a valve you sealed. Every element was designed with a single purpose, to capture and control every possible unit of thermal energy from the wood. They finished the work in late October. The last stone was set, the last joint was mortared. The stovepipe, a narrow, unassuming metal tube, was fitted through the roof and sealed against the weather. The monolithic structure stood in the center of the cabin, a silent, brooding presence of gray stone and black iron. It was massive, almost architectural. The top surface was a wide, flat expanse of polished stone that would serve as a cooking surface. From the front, the small, heavy iron door and the simple air vent handle were its only visible controls. The aspen trees had shed their gold, and the nights were growing sharp with the promise of snow. The season of danger was imminent. The folly was complete. The day of the first test arrived with a cold, clear sky. A hard frost had silvered the ground. John and Samuel stood before the stove, a pile of dry kindling and split logs at the ready. A quiet tension filled the cabin. Months of labor, of obsession, of ridicule had all led to this moment. John took a deep breath, the air cold in his lungs. He opened the heavy iron door. The inside of the firebox was a dark, clean cavern of metal and clay. He methodically laid the fire, a base of tinder, a small lattice of kindling, and a few pieces of larger, seasoned pine. He struck a match. The flame caught, and a small, bright fire began to crackle. He left the door slightly ajar to provide ample air for the initial burn. He watched not the flames, but the smoke. At first, it was thick and white, the typical smoke of a new fire. He slowly closed the door until it sealed with a dull, satisfying thud. Then, he began to manipulate the primary air vent, a small rotating disc on the door. He opened it just enough to keep the fire burning brightly, but not so much that it roared out of control. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the wood and the faint hiss of the draft. For an hour, he did nothing but watch and listen, occasionally adding a larger log. He laid his hand on the stone exterior. It was still cold as the grave. Inside the iron core, however, the temperature was climbing steadily. He could hear the faint pinging of the metal as it expanded. He watched the small wisp of smoke rising from the chimney outside. It was still a dirty gray. The system was not yet hot enough. Patience. After another hour, the internal temperature reached the critical point. John could feel the change. The sound of the fire deepened. The hiss of the draft grew stronger. A faint, deep warmth was finally beginning to radiate from the stone nearest the firebox. Now was the time. He reached for a simple iron lever protruding from the side of the stove. This lever controlled a damper that opened the secondary air inlets. He pulled it slowly. The effect was instantaneous and utterly astonishing. A new sound joined the crackle of the fire, a low, deep roar, like the sound of a distant waterfall. It was the sound of the smoke igniting. John and Samuel peered through the small mica window John had installed in the firebox door. Where before there had been a churning mass of orange flames and black smoke, there was now a mesmerizing spectacle. The smoke, swirling below the baffle plate, was being met by the jets of preheated air. It erupted into a secondary bloom of fire, a clean, intensely hot blue-white flame that danced and writhed like a living creature. The stove was burning its own smoke. Outside, the proof was undeniable. The column of gray smoke from the chimney faltered, thinned, and then vanished. It was replaced by a clear, shimmering distortion in the air, the visual signature of pure heat. The system worked. It worked exactly as he had designed it. A slow, triumphant smile spread across John's face. He looked at Samuel, whose eyes were wide with wonder. The boy had seen fire his whole life, but he had never seen anything like this. Over the next few hours, the true power of the stove revealed itself. The stone monolith, which had taken so long to warm, began to release its stored energy. It was not the harsh, scorching heat of a pot-bellied stove. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that filled the entire cabin, from floor to ceiling. The drafts vanished. The cold corners disappeared. The air was clean and breathable, free of the acrid stink of wood smoke. After the fire had been burning for 3 hours, John closed both the primary and secondary air vents almost completely. The fire inside died down to a bed of glowing coals, consuming almost no fuel. But the stove, its massive stone body now saturated with heat, continued to radiate a steady, comfortable warmth for hours. One load of wood did the work of 4. The neighbors, of course, remained unconvinced. They saw the lack of smoke from Thornton's chimney and drew the wrong conclusion. Garrett rode by one evening and saw the warm, inviting glow of the lamp through John's window. He could feel the warmth even from outside. "Burning through your wood pile to keep that rock pile hot, Thornton?" he shouted, his voice thick with sarcasm. "You'll be out of fuel by Christmas." John simply nodded, a quiet smile on his face. He knew he would have wood to spare when every other man in the valley was scraping the bottom of his pile. The folly had passed its first private test, but its true validation would require a trial by fire, or rather, by ice. Winter arrived not with a gentle descent, but with a sudden, violent assault. The early snows of November were heavier than usual, but the old-timers dismissed it as a fluke. Then, in the first week of December 1883, the sky turned a strange, bruised purple gray, and the air grew unnaturally still and heavy. The temperature began to plummet. It was the beginning of the Great Blizzard, an event that would pass into legend, a storm against which all other storms in the region would be measured for a generation. For 8 days, the world dissolved into a screaming chaos of wind and snow. The wind did not just blow, it shrieked, a physical force that shook the log cabins to their foundations and drove the snow into every crack and crevice. The snow was not flakes, but a blinding, horizontal torrent of fine, sharp ice crystals that buried fences, barns, and entire landscapes under mountainous drifts. Temperatures dropped to 30, then 40 degrees below zero, not counting the wind chill, which was a thing of pure, lethal abstraction. To be caught outside was a death sentence. Survival became a simple equation of shelter, warmth, and fuel. Throughout the valley, a systemic failure was underway. In cabin after cabin, the conventional pot-bellied stoves became tyrants. They devoured wood at an insatiable rate, their roaring fires doing little to combat the ferocious, penetrating cold. The heat they produced shot straight up the stovepipes, which, coated with freezing creosote and battered by the wind, became dangerously clogged or failed entirely. Families huddled close to their failing fires, wrapped in every layer they owned, and still they shivered. The cabins, which had seemed so sturdy in the summer, were revealed to be fragile shells. The wind found every weakness, pouring in streams of Arctic air that felt like streams of icy water. In Garrett's cabin, the situation was becoming desperate. He had a wife and 2 small children. His stove, one of the largest and most expensive models from the catalog, was burning through his meticulously stacked woodpile at a terrifying pace. He stuffed it with logs constantly, but the cabin remained dangerously cold. The windows were opaque with thick ice. The water in the bucket by the door was a solid block. On the 4th day of the storm, his youngest son developed a hacking cough, the sound sharp and brittle in the cold air. Fear, a cold he had never known before, began to grip Garrett's heart. He was losing. The narrative of survival crosscut between this widespread desperation and the impossible calm in John Thornton's cabin. Inside Thornton's folly, there was peace. The storm howled outside, a distant, frustrated beast, but inside, a steady, even warmth filled the small space. The great stone stove radiated its heat gently, endlessly. John had to add a few logs only twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. The firebox, operating at peak efficiency, consumed the wood slowly and completely, leaving behind only a fine, white ash. The secondary combustion roared silently within its iron heart, wringing every last calorie of energy from the fuel. John and Samuel sat at their table, reading by the light of a kerosene lamp, the air clean and warm. They were not merely surviving, they were comfortable. They had an abundance of fuel, an abundance of warmth. They had time. On the 6th day, the crisis arrived at Garrett's door. He went to his woodpile, a sheltered lean-to against the side of his cabin, and found only a few frozen logs remaining. A wave of panic washed over him. He had thought he had enough for 2 winters. The storm had taken it in less than a week. He brought the last of the wood inside and fed it to the stove, but he knew it was a futile gesture. Within hours, the fire would die, and the cold, the real, killing cold of the blizzard, would pour into his home. His wife looked at him, her face pale with fear, her arms wrapped around their coughing son. Desperation drove him to an action he would have thought impossible a week earlier. He had to get help. But where? All his neighbors were in the same predicament. Then he thought of Thornton. He thought of the man's strange, smokeless chimney. He thought of the taunts, the nickname he himself had coined. Thornton's folly. What if it wasn't a folly? What if the madman was the only sane one among them? Clinging to that sliver of hope, Garrett made a decision. He wrapped himself in his heaviest coat, pulled his hat down low, and plunged out into the white chaos. The journey of a mile to Thornton's cabin was a Dantean struggle. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, suffocating powder that made every step an agony of effort. He couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of him. He navigated by memory, by the faint outline of trees, by sheer force of will. He fell a dozen times, the cold seeping into his bones, his hope dwindling with every passing minute. He was on the verge of collapse, ready to lie down and let the snow take him, when he stumbled against something solid, a wall. He felt his way along it until his frozen hand found the edge of a door. It was Thornton's cabin. He hammered on the door with what little strength he had left. The door swung open, and Garrett fell inside, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of snow and ice. He lay there, gasping, expecting to be met with a cold as bitter as the one in his own home. Instead, he was hit by a wave of warmth, a deep, gentle, life-giving warmth. He looked up, his eyes blurry, and saw John Thornton standing over him, his face calm and concerned. The cabin was bright, peaceful. In the center of the room stood the great stone stove, a silent, benevolent giant, radiating heat. Garrett, the skeptic, the mocker, broke down and wept. There was no "I told you so." There was no hint of triumph in John's eyes. There was only compassion. He and Samuel helped Garrett to a chair, gave him a cup of hot broth warmed on the stove's surface, and listened to his desperate story. Without a word, John and Samuel began to prepare. They packed a sled with blankets and hot, sealed stones taken from the top of the stove. Then, the three of them ventured back out into the storm. They followed the path Garrett had broken, a journey that was, if anything, more harrowing than the first. They reached his cabin to find a scene of bleak misery. The fire was dead. The air was frigid. Garrett's wife was huddled with her children under a pile of blankets, their breath misting in the air. They worked quickly, bundling the mother and children in the warm blankets, placing the hot stones at their feet. They helped them onto the sled and began the long, slow journey back to the haven of Thornton's cabin. They made it. They brought the freezing family into the warmth, and for the first time in days, the fear began to recede from their faces. The rescue was complete. The folly had saved them. Over the next 2 days, as the blizzard finally blew itself out, Thornton's cabin became a refugee camp. Word somehow traveled on the wind, and 2 other families, their own fuel exhausted, made the desperate trek to his door. John welcomed them all. The small cabin was crowded, but it was warm. The stove, his magnificent creation, performed without flaw. It kept more than a dozen people safe and warm, its steady, efficient heat a bulwark against the storm's fury. The absolute vindication was not spoken, it was lived. Everyone in that room, including the man who had named it, knew that Thornton's folly was a work of pure genius. The mockery had died, frozen in the wind, and in its place grew a profound and humbling respect. When the sun finally reappeared, glittering on a world transformed and buried by snow, the survivors emerged from Thornton's cabin. The valley was silent, pristine, and littered with the evidence of the storm's passage. Collapsed roofs, buried woodpiles, and the quiet tragedy of livestock frozen in their barns. In the days that followed, as the community dug itself out and counted its losses, a new conversation began. It started with Garrett. He approached John Thornton one morning, his hat in his hands, his face stripped of all its former arrogance. He stood before John, not as a mocker, but as a student. "John," he began, his voice quiet and heavy with humility, "I was wrong. About everything. What you built, it saved my family. It saved us all." He paused, gathering his courage. "Will you teach me? Will you show me how to build one?" This was the moment John had been working toward, though he had never consciously framed it as such. It was not a moment for pride or for payment. It was a moment to fulfill the vow he had made in the cold silence of his grief. He looked at Garrett, a man humbled by the near loss of everything he held dear, and saw not an antagonist, but a fellow man who needed to protect his family. "Of course I will," John said simply. He went inside and returned with his worn leather journal, the one filled with the sketches and calculations from his journey of discovery. He opened it and began to explain the principles. He shared his knowledge freely, holding nothing back. He explained the necessity of the insulated firebox, the critical function of the preheated secondary air, the logic of the baffle plate, and the profound importance of the thermal mass. He gave away his genius without a thought for credit or compensation. His only motive was the prevention of future tragedies. That spring, a new kind of construction began in the valley. Under John's quiet guidance, Garrett built his own masonry stove, a near-perfect copy of the original. He worked with the fervor of a convert, his former mockery replaced by a deep, abiding respect for the physics of heat. Another neighbor, then another, followed suit. John became the valley's unofficial consulting engineer. The designs began to vary slightly as people adapted them to their own cabins and the materials they had on hand. Some used more brick, procured at great expense from the town. Others, like John, used carefully selected fieldstone. But the core principles, staged combustion and thermal mass, became the new gospel of winter survival. Thornton's folly became the Thornton stove, a name spoken with reverence. The idea, too powerful to remain confined to one small valley, began to spread. The next winter, a surveyor for the railroad, a man named Henderson, was forced to winter over in the valley. He was a man of education and keen observation. He saw the strange, massive stoves in every cabin and noted, with an engineer's appreciation, their incredible efficiency. He saw the clean-burning chimneys, the comfortable, smoke-free homes, the small, conserved wood piles. He spent long evenings with John, filling a notebook with detailed drawings and notes, capturing the essence of the design. When Henderson left in the spring, he carried that notebook with him. He was the disseminator. He shared the plans with builders and settlers in the new towns springing up along the railway lines in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. The design was a revolution for high-altitude construction. It was perfectly suited to the long, brutal winters and the limited supply of timber on the high plains. As the innovation spread, its origin began to blur. The name Thornton stove was too specific, too local. In the Gunnison Valley, it became known as the Gunnison heater. In Wyoming, builders called it a mountain masonry stove. A popular settler's guide published a few years later included a chapter on building a winter-proof home, featuring a simplified version of the design it called, for no particular reason, the Summit Heater. The idea became anonymous, absorbed into the collective wisdom of the frontier. It became common sense. John Thornton's name and the memory of his personal tragedy was slowly erased from the story. The narrative of John Thornton's life slowed, the years passing like the quiet turning of the seasons. He lived a long and peaceful life in his valley. He watched his son Samuel grow into a man, marry, and build his own cabin, complete with a masonry stove even larger and more refined than the original. The valley prospered. The crude log cabins were replaced by more permanent homes, but the heart of each house remained a massive stone heater, a silent monument to the man who had taught them how to conquer the cold. John never sought credit. He never spoke of his invention to outsiders. His satisfaction came not from recognition, but from the sight of the thin, clean wisps of smoke rising from the chimneys on a cold winter's night. It was the quiet, unassuming sign of a victory won. He died in his sleep one mild spring evening, an old man whose work was done. His son and his neighbors buried him in the small cemetery on the hill, next to the grave of his wife, Mary. The two headstones stood side by side, a testament to a love and a loss that had, in its own way, changed the world, or at least a small, cold corner of it. Samuel carved the inscription on his father's stone himself. It was simple, humble, and said nothing of his true legacy. It read, John Thornton, husband, father, pioneer. Decades later, long after the valley was electrified and the old stoves were no longer the primary source of heat, historians and architects would sometimes stumble upon the old homesteads. They would find the massive stone structures still dominating the main rooms, and they would marvel at their sophisticated design, at the clear understanding of combustion science they represented. They would write papers on these anonymous folk technologies, speculating on their origins. They would never know the full story. They would never know about Mary's cough, or the hated pot-bellied stove, or the quiet man whose grief hardened into a genius that saved an unmeasurable number of lives. The impact was enduring, but its author was forgotten. The story ends where it began, on a bitterly cold winter night in the high Rockies. A blanket of fresh snow muffles the world in a profound silence, the stars burning like chips of ice in the black sky. In the valley below, a dozen homes glow with a warm, steady light, and from their chimneys there rises not the thick black smoke of a struggle, but only the faintest, cleanest shimmer of heat ascending to the heavens, a quiet, ghostly testament to the man who learned the secrets of the fire and then gave them away for free.